Welcome. Have a few new people in the door. So thanks for joining us tonight. As you come in, if you want to put your name, pronouns, and the organization you are with, if you are with one, and then also your connection to the Lower Southeast Rising Plan area into the chat. All right, we have a few new people in the door. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. If you could put into the chat your name, your pronouns, and then your organization if you're representing one, and then your connection to the Lower Southeast Rising Plan area. All right, seeing some responses. Live in the area. Excited to see the planning move forward. Local realtor, resident. I'll reveal that I'm just on the edge of the area too, so I've got some vested interest in tonight as well. I'm very excited. Received the mailer today. That's great. That is awesome. Right. Give it just another minute so we wait for people to join. Really appreciate everyone joining us tonight. How do I get on the mailing list? You know, we will post a link to our e-newsletter emailing list, I believe, at the end of the, let's see. Actually, I'm not totally sure the answer. Bill, is there a mailing list that folks can get on? Oh, you're muted.
Shane, would you mind?
Who are you talking to?
Hello, this is.
Go ahead.
Hi, this is Bill Cunningham, and the question was about how do you sign up for project updates? And we do have a project update sign up button on our project website. Shane, would you mind kind of finding a link to that? I think PBOT manages the sign up sheet for updates.
Yep, I just posted it in the chat.
Great, awesome, thank you. All right, well, I think we will go ahead and get started. My name is Wayne Grabowski. I work at the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. I use he, him pronouns, and I support community engagement in general. And I am very excited today to support Lower Southeast Rising Plan. We will get started in a second. I do want to give you a reminder that today's meeting is being recorded and live streamed to YouTube. If you do have any technical support needs or any questions you have about the meeting itself, you can message me directly and I will do my best to help sort you out. And with that, I will turn it over to Bill.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm Bill Cunningham. I'm a co-project manager for this project. This project is really led jointly by the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, and I'm representing that planning side. And then we have Shane Valley from the Portland Bureau of Transportation, who's representing the transportation side. So it's really both looking at land use and transportation in terms of the solutions we've been working on for this area. But you're all very welcome to be at our Lower Southeast Rising Area Plan information session. Just very glad you're all here. We're happy to be sharing the plan's discussion draft, which is really the result of over a year and a half of community discussions, input, and staff analysis. And I know that some of you have participated in providing input to the project or have also been involved in some of our advisory committees. So very much appreciate your role in shaping the plan. Because it's definitely been guided by what we've been hearing from the community. We actually don't have a mandate for something we must impose upon the community. This project's really about working with the community to address some of the issues in the plan area. And just to remind people what the purpose of this session is, to really provide a summary of the plan's proposals and answer questions and point you in the right direction in terms of how you can learn more about the project proposals and provide input. So it's probably not going to be a whole lot of time for a robust discussion. It's more like tip of the iceberg. We're going to introduce you to what's in the plan, where to look for more, and answer questions. I'm going to share some slides if people are all right with that. Just a second. All right, do people see a slide?
Yes.
All right, excellent. And I'm glad Wing's here. Wing will definitely be backing us up in terms of any technical issues, which are not impossible. Well, we're working on the Lower Southeast Rising Plan. Wanted to say a little bit as to what the focus of the plan has been and actually go through the agenda for tonight. We are introducing the plan, of course. We're going to provide some project background as to why we're doing the project, what were some of the things that we're hearing from the community. And then we're going to focus on our land use proposals, provide a Q&A opportunity once I go through that. And then Shane will be sharing the transportation proposals. And then there'll be another opportunity for questions and answers regarding the transportation recommendations. And then a key thing is I wanted to point again the direction so that you can learn more on your own and provide input, because that's the absolutely most important part of this work. I want to emphasize that the discussion draft is really the first opportunity to have a draft available for the public to review proposals. So it's actually not a formal proposal yet. They're just draft proposals, and your feedback is going to help us refine the plan before it becomes a formal proposal. The next step after we refine the plan is for the proposals to go to the Portland Planning Commission for a public hearing and their review, which will likely happen in September. I guess I could have been talking about what's coming next when we had the project timeline slide. So this project kicked off just about a year ago in the spring of 2021. There's a lot of work in analyzing issues in the area and looking at potential ways of addressing some of the challenges in the area. And then in the spring and summer of 2022, there's a pretty intense public engagement phase, and Shane will share a little bit more about that. In the fall, we were looking at how we take the concerns people have identified and people's priorities into developing a plan with prioritized implementation approaches and actually turning it into the draft plan. So we're right now in that draft plan phase, that discussion draft phase. And this slide also shows the project area. Roughly, it extends from about Southeast Chavez east to about 92nd or I-205 roughly. And on the north, it's from Holgate and Foster down to the southern end of edge of the city boundary. And the core focus area of the plan has been the Brentwood-Darlington neighborhood. That area has some of the most significant challenges in terms of access to services and transportation infrastructure issues. And I do want to emphasize one thing we've heard from people is they didn't want us to emphasize just the issues and problems in the area. People really value the community in the area, the network of parks and schools. So there's a lot of positive things in the area, and we definitely want to acknowledge that. But there was definitely interest in addressing some of the issues and making it an even better place. Let's see. With that, actually, I'm going to pass things over to Pam Hodge. Pam Hodge has been active with our project. She's been a member of our project's community advisory committee. We have representatives or people who live or work in a number of the neighborhoods in the area. And Pam Hodge has been a very active member of our project advisory committee, as well as being a resident of the Brentwood Darlington neighborhood. So I think with that, I'm going to stop sharing and I'll turn it over to Pam.
Oh, well, thank you, Bill. Again, hello, everyone. My name is Pam Hodge. And last week, Bill asked me to say a few words about the project plan from the perspective of a Brentwood Darlington resident and member of the project advisory committee. So just to clarify, I'm not speaking on behalf of the Brentwood Darlington Neighborhood Association, even though I sit on the board. The board hasn't had an opportunity to formally consider the plan yet. So broadly speaking, as Bill said, the project plan recommends land use and transportation changes, including the creation of commercial corridors in a neighborhood center. So I'd like to frame my remarks about the project plan in terms of the underlying need to address population growth and climate change while enhancing neighborhood livability and community resiliency. I believe the proposed plan meets all of these objectives. So my perspective as a Brentwood Darlington resident and PAC member was shaped by my personal and family history. I was born here in 1957, grew up here, and came back to the neighborhood a few years ago to care for aging parents. I now live in my childhood home at 58th and Harney Drive, a few blocks uphill from Precision Cast Parts and across the street from Clackamas County. As you will see from the map on page 25 of the report, I live in the Errol Heights section of Brentwood Darlington, an area which is still considered one of the least complete areas of the neighborhood. Like Brentwood Darlington overall, only more so, Errol Heights is an area where residents do not have safe and convenient access to goods and services they need on a daily or regular basis. So with respect to land use changes, I have a few comments about my personal, family, and neighborhood history that illustrate creative land use in response to growth and evolving needs. In the early 1950s, my parents bought a house with a large lot on Flavel Drive. Because land was relatively cheap back then, even for a working class single income family, they also bought a smaller adjoining lot on Harney Drive. My parents subdivided the large Flavel Drive property and built a new home for themselves on the southern half of the property fronting Harney Drive. The original home on Flavel Drive became my family's source of rental income and eventually served as my grandmother's ADU or granny flat. All the time I was growing up, my family farmed the land on the adjoining smaller lot. Because of our home garden, we ate well even during the famous 1962 Columbus Day storm when the roads became impassable. That early childhood experience taught me the importance of reserving land for small-scale urban agriculture to promote community resiliency when the big one hits. I'd also like to note that we are not the only Brentwood Darlington family to make creative use of land in response to growth. I personally know several neighbors who have modified larger single-family homes to accommodate the evolving housing needs of caregivers and extended family members, or to generate rental income. I am sure we could find more examples. So, although I support the multi-story housing and mixed-use complexes proposed for the new neighborhood center and commercial corridors, I also believe additional growth can occur organically throughout the neighborhood by way of other creative land use options. With respect to transportation needs, I have childhood memories of walking almost a mile up 60th Avenue to Lane School, then K through 8, riding my bike up Clatsop and 72nd to Mount Scott Community Center, and later catching the nearest bus at the corner of 52nd and Flavel Street, over half a mile away, to attend Franklin High. There were no sidewalks, bike lanes, or crosswalks on those streets growing up. The plan recommends funding for a new network of transportation infrastructure throughout the study area, including bike and pedestrian corridor improvements on 52nd and 72nd Avenues and Flavel and Harney Drives. The plan also recommends funding for the creation of a number of neighborhood greenways, including a neighborhood greenway on 60th. Finally, then as now, Brentwood Darlington lacked a commercial center and was definitely not a walkable 20-minute neighborhood. Residents were largely car dependent. The project plan creates a neighborhood center on 72nd and commercial corridors on both 72nd and 52nd Avenues that would provide more neighborhood amenities and make all of us less car dependent, an important consideration in an era of climate change. Given my personal and family history, I was eager to serve on the Project Advisory Committee. Along with some 21 other members of the PAC, I've attended 11 meetings over what I think is the past 2 years to review and provide advisory comments to staff as the project developed. The draft before you now is an outgrowth of extensive staff analyses and community input. I believe the draft plan is a thoughtful response to community needs. I'm particularly impressed by the community stabilization strategies listed on pages 57 through 61 of the report, which include redevelopment of the existing Brentwood Darlington Community Center at 62nd and Knapp as a neighborhood resource for social services and climate-related emergencies. One of my primary concerns is that the desired changes may not occur within our lifetimes without adequate public funding. The community stabilization strategies include recommendations for funding through designation as a Prosper Portland Neighborhood Prosperity Initiative and the possible creation of a community-based tax increment financing district like the one approved by the City Council last year for the Cully neighborhood. Lastly, with respect to community input, there have been multiple rounds of public engagement over the past 2 years. You now have another opportunity to further shape the project plan before it goes to the Planning Commission and the City Council. As a long-term Brentwood Darlington resident and member of the Project Advisory Committee, I urge you to read the draft report and provide additional feedback to fine-tune the recommendations prior to the survey deadline on June 23rd. Thank you for allowing me to share my perspectives.
You provided a pretty good overview of the plan yourself. I think we're kind of done. We can move straight to questions. No, thanks, Pam. We'll provide a bit of a staff fleshing out of what you shared, but that was great. Really appreciate it. I'm going to go back to our slides. Just a moment. All right. We're moving on now to just provide you a bit of background as to the whys of this project, why we're starting to look at this place to begin with. And part of this was what Pam alluded to, related to complete neighborhoods. Back in the Portland plan several years ago, there was an objective created based on community input that we really wanted to create a city where people had options to be able to walk, bike, or take transit to local services, and that we had a safe ways of getting to those neighbor destinations. And part of our analysis, we called it a 20-minute neighborhoods analysis or complete neighborhoods analysis, was looking at what places have concentrations of commercial services and grocery stores, where are the schools and parks, and do we have infrastructure like sidewalks and bicycle facilities and transit that allows people to easily get to those destinations. And the places that have a lot of those attributes, those aspects of complete neighborhoods show up in this map as hotspots. And you can kind of see Woodstock is a hotspot in this area, frankly. All the businesses, definitely an anchor for services and for a complete neighborhood. And the blue and purple areas are places that typically don't have those aspects. And in this area, like the Brentwood Darlington neighborhood, really does not have much in terms of those commercial services. There's a little bit of a hot spot over near the grocery outlet at 72nd and Flavel, but this is an area where the transportation infrastructure has been lagging what we expect in the city. And the city's goal is that 80% of the city of residents will be able to live in complete neighborhoods. And the Brentwood Darlington area and some of the surrounding areas are amongst those places where we're not there yet. So a lot of interest in addressing that and making it easier to meet your daily needs locally. And the project objectives, they really flowed from what we're hearing from the community and a lot of the issues that are identified. And the objectives include increasing opportunities for neighborhood businesses. And I should mention, when it came to the community input and the survey we had a while back, expanding commercial opportunities was the #1 priority that was identified by people in the area. And then increasing housing choices and affordability, which happened to be the #2 priority, is also a project objective. And then getting to those neighbor destinations, having active and green transportation options as another key project objective. And community stability is also something we have some recommendations for in our plan. And part of the idea here is, as the area improves, we want everyone to benefit from those improvements rather than being potentially displaced when changes happen. This plan is not, frankly, addressing all issues in the area. It's really focused on some land use changes to really move forward on better meeting those objectives for expanding commercial and housing opportunities. The other part was really focused on those transportation projects to make it easier and safer for people to get around the community. And there are also recommendations for community stability, and that's actually baked into some of the zoning recommendations as well. So I'm going to pass things on to Shane just to say a little bit about the public engagement we've had and how we heard from the community.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. And again, my name is Shane Valley. I'm a senior planner at the Bureau of Transportation, and I'm co-project managing this with Bill, kind of focused on the transportation side of things, that is land use. And so as far as what the sort of the community engagement foundation of this plan, really from the start, we kind of had our marching orders from the community on this. There were several decades of community planning that pointed to a lot of the issues that the recommendations of this plan kind of tackle and provide updated answers to. So the first year of the plan was kind of us doing our homework, sort of validating the things that we had heard already from the community for the years leading up to this. So the conditions of the sidewalks, the lack of a clear neighborhood center in Brentwood Darlington. And so for a year, we were kind of having one-on-one conversations with community stakeholders, doing some of our own analysis. And then in mid 2022, last year, we came out with a big outreach push, just kind of asking for further validation. Do we have the right problem statement? Are we trying to solve the right problems? Are our sort of proposed solutions headed in the right directions? If these are the right problems, are these the right sets of solutions? And by and large, we received a pretty positive response that we're kind of on the right track. We got over 500 responses on our survey. We worked with community organizations like Rose TDC and Latino Network to sort of strengthen our outreach to communities that it's traditionally been pretty hard for us to reach with traditional public involvement tools. We held several walks, bike rides to sort of get out into the community and experience firsthand the things that you all have been living with. And then we had a survey that really, or our survey that we got the 500 responses to, really focused on developing and helping us refine these community development scenarios that Bill will go into right now.
All right, thanks, Shane. Without further ado, I'm going to launch into some of the background and that engagement and what we heard from the community that really shaped, especially the land use proposals in this case. In some of the community discussions and in the survey, we also had an online open house. We presented 4 land use scenarios for the possible future evolution of the community. And so we didn't want to assume that change is something that people really wanted to see in a great degree. And we had a number of options. We had a scenario that was basically a little or no change, basically no change to zoning or what have you. We also had something that was a sort of a soft, a fairly light touch, just Right now, there are currently some small commercial hubs at places like 52nd and Duke and at Faville. And part of the idea is, well, let's expand maybe some of the commercial hubs in those locations so we can get a few more commercial services, but nothing radical. And then moving up the spectrum of change, we also put out the idea of how about the broader corridors of 52nd and 72nd? What about expanding housing options along those corridors? And there's also interest in improving transit along them as well. Part of that scenario was increasing opportunities to have small businesses along with the housing on those corridors. And then number 4 was probably the greatest degree of change. It had the other aspects of the scenarios. It had the small commercial hubs. It had focusing on the corridors, but it also introduced the idea of creating a new neighborhood center or neighborhood business district in the vicinity of 72nd and Faville. And that scenario received more community support than all the other scenarios combined. So that scenario, which I'm going to dive into just a little bit more, is what shaped our proposals. We had also asked for people's input on transportation priorities, and Shane will get into the details of this, but we were asking people as to what are the most important corridors for safety improvements, where are the most important places to get improved pedestrian and bicycle connections, what do you think about the transit network and how to improve it? So that will be explained by Shane moving forward. Just wanted to say a little bit again about that preferred land use scenario, the centers and corridor scenario. I do want to highlight that the zoning proposals we have in the discussion draft are really intended to move us from these bubble diagrams to actual proposals for land use and zoning changes. And as I mentioned before, probably the biggest move here is cultivating 72nd and Faville area, basically around the grocery outlet as a new neighborhood center, potentially a new neighborhood main street along 72nd going south from grocery outlet. What we heard from people is people really like some of the opportunities that places like the Woodstock Main Street provided, but they'd like to have some of those things closer by. So that's part of the idea with this neighborhood center. And this also has that concept of the small commercial areas at intersections and doing more to expand those or really make them more viable, as well as the idea of expanding housing opportunities on the major corridors. Just want to share how this relates to our current land use policies. The city has a concept of neighborhood centers, basically these mixed use or commercial areas that are anchors for commercial and community services for the area. And our existing designated centers in this area include Woodstock, there's Heart of Foster, that includes the Mercado area, as well as the Lentz Town Center. And this the circles are showing about a half-mile distance, which is about the furthest most people are willing to walk. And only about 32% of the area's residents are within that half-mile walking distance from the core of an existing center. And if we were to move forward with the idea of a new Brentwood Darlington neighborhood center and over time develop a more thriving business district in that area, you could see with this dashed line circle that it really helped fill in the gap in terms of walkable access to services in the area. So that's a policy framework that this really relates to. One thing, just as background information, is the yellow and orange tones here show where the single dwelling zones are. It's the vast majority of land in the area at 74%, which citywide it's 45% is single dwelling zoning. So this area is a lot of single dwelling zoning. 10%, the blue areas are multi-dwelling, and commercial zoning is the red and pink areas. It's just 6%, and most of what's there is up on Woodstock or along Foster or in Lentz. So not a lot in the Brentwood Darlington area in terms of zoning that would even allow commercial services to happen over time. I'm going to just launch right into the land use proposals, which relate to what I was just sharing. I'm sure that not everyone is totally up to speed about zones. So I wanted to give you a little bit of a a thumbnail version of our zones that are being proposed for expansion in the area. Basically, our small scale multi-dwelling zone is the RM1 zone. That's a 2 to 3 story zone. It allows a similar scale that's allowed in the single dwelling zones. You can't cover more than half of the lot with buildings, so there's a fair amount of landscaping expected. It's really intended to be fairly compatible with where single family housing is predominant. It does allow the big difference with the single dwelling zones, which the single dwelling zones already allow townhouses. The RM1 zone allows more flexibility for the numbers of units. Then RM2 is a more of a medium scale multi-dwelling zone, 3 to 4 stories. Typically, this zone is along our transit corridors or in our mixed use centers. And then for our commercial mixed use zones, which allow commercial as well as residential in most cases, we have our CR zone, which is essentially a corner store type zone, which applies often in little corner areas surrounded by residential. And there are a few places we're proposing that. And then we have CM1, which is a 2 to 3 story scale, fairly small scale commercial mixed use zone. And that image is showing an example of that scale. And that's actually on Woodstock, I think is a little bit east of 52nd. And then CM2 zone is our standard 3 to 4 story zone that applies typically in the core areas of our mixed use centers. So that's a zone you have on the Woodstock Main Street and Foster and parts of Lentz. So basically, the smaller the number, the smaller the scale. As you have a bigger number, RM2, it's a bigger scale. Just a very broad 500-foot level, or I don't know, half-mile level view looking down into the plan area. This is just showing the areas of potential change. And the blue tones are the multi-dwelling zones that are proposed for changes in the area. And then the red and pinkish tones are showing areas where there would be expanded commercial zoning. And you can see some of the pattern here. Most of that zoning is focused on those corridors. And it also includes that proposed new neighborhood center, which I've outlined in orange here. And the zone changes would affect about 6% of the plan area. So it's pretty strategic. It's really focused in the places where the services are, where transit's expected. And I'm going to get into some of the details in the next few slides. I'm going to do a time check too, make sure we're on schedule. As I mentioned before, one of the bigger moves is this idea of a new Brentwood-Darlington neighborhood center around 72nd and Favell. And I'll leave it up to you what its actual name will end up being. I'm using that term because it is really in the heart of the Brentwood-Darlington neighborhood. But the concepts include the idea of a Main Street business district that would be promoted by, or at the very least allowed by, zone changes to expand commercial zoning on 72nd and beyond where the grocery outlet is, mostly to the south. That yellow or gold color is showing that small neighborhood Main Street. And there would also be a smaller commercial hub out southeast Favell and 82nd to really anchor that part of the area. And over by 82nd, both immediately to the east and further and the west, there are a number of mobile home parks, as you might be aware, and apartment complexes. There isn't a lot of in terms of a neighborhood anchor with services for that area. And the idea with that 82nd hub is it would help serve those people living in that housing. And the blue is showing that there are proposals for some zone changes to allow more housing, including some zone changes to multifamily close to where the services would be. I did want to highlight one thing that is part of the proposal. 82nd Avenue, pretty much the whole southern portion of 82nd, including this area, is zoned for employment and light industrial uses. It doesn't allow housing. What's there now are mostly small commercial uses. Actually, this diagram is showing some of what's there. Those of you familiar with the area already know there's bar, a couple mini mart type things, some restaurants, motels. So it's not really very much of an industrial type area. And the proposal is to rezone to commercial mixed use really cultivate this area over time and signaling the intention that it should be a commercial hub for the area. This would also allow housing on upper levels and require a bit more of a pedestrian orientation over time with the way development happens there. But this would be a change from the current zoning, from employment to commercial mixed use. The neighborhood corridors, as we mentioned before, that they would be a focus for the changes to allow more housing on those corridors. And any multi-dwelling zoning we'd apply on 52nd or 72nd also comes with some allowances for small ground floor commercial uses there. And our analysis is showing there's actually a fair number of home-based businesses along those corridors, especially 72nd. And the new allowances would allow people to expand their business and be a bit more public facing with signage and have allowances for more customers than currently is the case. The corridor options would also include the idea of enhancing those the commercial zoning opportunities at the intersections. And along with this is what Shane will share. These corridors are the busier streets, and there are recommendations for safety improvements and better crossings, as well as recommendations for improved transit service there. These are the locations where the zoning would be expanded to allow more opportunities for commercial services. And I will be highlighting how you can learn more and take a closer look at this on our online open house. But again, tip of the iceberg right for now. These are showing the specific places where the zone changes to allow more commercial would happen. You could see them at the hubs, and you could see that in the core area of the potential new neighborhood center on 72nd, there would be an allowance for that medium scale CM2 mixed use zone, while it's typically the smaller CM1 scale and some of the smaller commercial hubs. You know, Flaville and 52nd is another place that would allow some of that medium scale development, because it is an important anchor for that part of the area. This is a key slide for just sharing what we're proposing in terms of the potential land use changes to allow more housing. Generally, the light blue that's shown on 72nd especially, and parts of 52nd, would rezone from, in some cases, the R2.5 single dwelling zone, which is a townhouse type zone, and occasionally R5, to the small scale RM1 zone. Again, it allows a similar scale, but more flexibility for the numbers of units on those key corridors. In some areas, especially in the hub locations, there'd be zone changes to allow medium scale multifamily, that 3 to 4 story scale, and that's that darker blue color. And that includes within areas close to the potential new neighborhood Main Street on Flaville. One thing useful to highlight is that these multifamily zones, especially when you're doing larger projects, have requirements for including affordable units together with the more market rate units. So that's a tool you don't have much in this area. There would be new requirements for including affordable units. Something to be aware of too is part of our goal is to really try to continue the existing relatively affordable apartments that are already there. So for the most part, our rezones are avoiding existing apartment complexes, especially when they don't have affordable housing regulations that they're protecting their viability. We didn't want to add additional development pressures to the apartments that are already affordable in the area. We're also not proposing any changes to the mobile home park zoning, including areas near the potential center, because we know that's an important resource as well, and that really feeds into the interest in community stability. Just a couple of the things. As I was mentioning, there's a designated center on Foster, the heart of Foster Neighborhood Center, and part of the proposal is to expand the boundaries of the center from Foster down 72nd over to where the Mount Scott Community Center is and Arleta Triangle. And that comes with it some policies that have requirements for more of a pedestrian orientation and over time additional pedestrian crossings. And there are some small additions for commercial zoning over by the Arleta Triangle. as well as allowances for more housing along Woodstock in this area and at the edge of the Lentz Town Center, basically over near 80th between Foster and Woodstock. We would be proposing to allow more of the medium scale multifamily. And I should mention that the area south of Woodstock in that area already has the medium scale multifamily zoning. It would be just putting that housing opportunity closest to where the services are. And one thing I want you to mention, especially related to any of these zone changes, is that the zone changes would not require any change to what's already there. If you have a house or a property, it could stay just as it is, or you could add to your house, do renovations. It mostly affects new development and opens up opportunities for new things to happen in those areas. Let's see. All right. So this is just summarizing again some of the major aspects of the proposal. So it's the center and the corridors, and it's both about expanding opportunities for commercial and expanding opportunities for housing. And something I'd really encourage you to think about when you're working on your comments is, we heard a lot from the community. That was the basis for the plan's objectives. And the proposals, of course, are intended to help make those objectives happen. And I'd like to have you think about our proposals. And of course, you could think about them in any way, but we're especially interested in hearing, with these proposals, from your perspective, are they doing much to expand opportunities for more neighborhood businesses and commercial services? Are they doing enough to expand housing options, especially since those two things are things we heard from the community were important? And do you have any thoughts for adjustments you think that would allow the proposals to better meet the project objectives or other considerations you have? So that's what I have for the land use proposals, and I wanted to open things up for questions that people might have.
Thanks, Bill. And if folks have questions, you can either drop your questions or comments in the chat, or you can use the virtual raise hand function. To raise your virtual hand, hover over your screen, you'll see a reactions button. And if you click that, it gives you a bunch of options, including raise hand. And then I can call on you if you raise your hand and let you unmute and ask a question. All right, Machu Williams.
Thanks. I guess I'm looking at the land use changes, and we talked about corner stores. I'm wondering, there's some other projects funded at PBOT, like the 60s Greenway. Have we looked at corner store options along the 60s Greenway outside of the aforementioned 67th and Herald? So for example, like 67th and Tolman, 67th Duke, 67th and Woodstock, are these options that support more neighborhood size commercial opportunities? Are they being considered?
That's a good question. During much of our project discussion, we had really focused on the major corridors, not so much those potential neighborhood greenways that are a bit more bike and pedestrian oriented. But that's certainly something you can suggest as an approach to get more commercial really at the hyper local level. If you look at our project document, there are a couple existing corner stores that have residential zoning that we're proposing to rezone to that CR corner retail type zone, but we weren't really proposing to create new CR zones where, say, there's a house. But if you have thoughts as to locations that would be great ones to have a corner store that right now just have a house and have single dwelling zoning, definitely be interested in your sharing that.
Great, thank you. We have a question in the chat. John says, what are advantages of CM2 rather than CM1? Why CM2 instead of CM1? And what is being done to address parking in centers?
Right. The first question about why CM2 rather than CM1. The reason we're looking at CM2 was our economic analysis is showing, if we actually want new development to happen, something that includes, say, ground floor commercial and upper floor residential, the CM2 zone has been a very economically viable zone. The CM1 zone has tended to see less development. CM1 is what already applies at 52nd and Flavel, for example. CM2 has just been our most effective zone in terms of being something that's attractive to make things happen. Especially having the upper floor residential has often been something that's really made things pencil to allow even the ground floor commercial to happen. And in terms of parking incentives, that's always a topic that we look at. PBOT also considers, what do we need in terms of to support neighborhood business districts, and that plays into some of the discussion about removal of parking. So that's been definitely a topic that's been part of our discussion. We also have requirements in the zoning code now, and this is fairly new, that there are allowances, especially in small sites, to not include parking, especially if you're providing some affordable housing, partially because, especially doing structured parking on a small site tends to be very expensive and can make development very impractical. But we now have requirements that if for properties that are proposing that, they need to also provide options for the residents, like the owner will have to provide transit passes or bike sharing memberships, car sharing memberships. So there's some opportunities that are now in the books to really encourage other ways of getting around.
Thanks, Bill. And John, I see you raised your hand if you want to unmute.
Yeah, this is actually Deb, the other half of John. So, I am, and so a question then about we're a block and a half north or around the corner from Flavel and 72nd on Henderson, and a question for PBOT would be, with an increase of structures in the area, we already have problems with water running down the roads, and so, for example, flooding our house. So we have a diversion system going on, but then we have on the south side of Henderson, and I've mentioned this last meeting too, we have a high concentration of apartments, and so there are lots of kids walking to school, and it's the sidewalk, which is parking and sidewalks are the fun topics, aren't they? So there's no sidewalks, there's no curbs, so water goes where it's going to go, kids go where they're going to go. If there is more increased housing, I think it's realistic to consider that there are going to be cars coming with residents and more people walking in the neighborhood. My concern then again is in those areas kind of bridging out from, or branching out from centers, that there's also going to be infrastructure being addressed around 72nd and Flavel, including managing water runoff from roadways and structures, as well as people and cars and bikes and kids.
I don't know if I caught the question, but all of the concerns you're raising are super valid. Yes, with more structures and residential structures, we certainly expect there to be more vehicles, as much as we would like the folks that are coming in who live there and are coming here to use the new options that we're going to create as a part of this plan. Bill, you might be able to speak better to we did work with Portland Water Bureau and the Bureau of Environmental Services to do an assessment of these recommended land use concepts, and they provided us some feedback about what some of those impacts as far as utilities and stormwater were going to be, but I don't know the details of that. Bill, do you recall any of that?
Yes. both the Bureau of Environmental Services, which deals with stormwater issues as well as water, chimed in on the zone changes. And they didn't really think that because of a relatively small increment of additional development allowance that the zone changes provide, they didn't think it would make a huge difference in terms of the existing management of stormwater and some of the infrastructure shortcomings in the area. They really felt, especially the new development, that they would need to address some of those issues, whether we have existing zoning stay as it is, or allow some of that low-scale multi-dwelling zoning. And something to be aware of too, the most common zone we're proposing is the RM1 zone, and it doesn't allow any more lot coverage or building coverage than the single dwelling zone. So it's not going to be a lot more built up. So yeah, I know it's not as thorough an answer, but definitely we're if you would like to provide us your questions, we'll look at providing a more complete answer too, and we'll be providing our project email where you could submit that. Looks like there's also questions coming from, let's see, a question about the east side of 52nd south of Duke being proposed for RM2 zoning. And isn't that area doesn't already have multifamily zoning? Yes, that the Apostolic Church property already has RM1 zoning, and that's the smallest scale zone. And as far as we know, it's going to stay there for the foreseeable future. But if there were to be change, part of the idea, especially being on what is anticipated to become a frequent transit street, allowing a somewhat larger scale, 3 to 4 story scale, could be something that could work really well, especially in a large site like that. So it's RM1 now, and it's proposed to go to RM2 multifamily. And then there's another question about CM2 zoning along 72nd, I think over by Mount Scott Park. And would that be shadowing or walling off Mount Scott Park? The zoning across the park right now is for the most part already there. It's already zoned to CM2. The recent development there, as you may be aware, hasn't really been maxing it out. They've been more 2 to 3 story scale, but we're not proposing significant change directly across the park across 72nd. Let's see. And someone raises Fire Station 1, the old Arrow Heights fire station. It was shown there because it's a little bit of an historic landmark or touchstone for the area. But yeah, it's not much. We are proposing changing the zoning from residential to allow to more of a small scale mixed use for the fire station, so that its future could be a little bit more flexible. It could be something other than just residential. Let's see. I think that covers the questions. All right, I'm gonna pass things over to Shane, and I'm gonna share my screen. And if we have time, we could also entertain more questions about land use, but I want to make sure that you hear some of the transportation proposals. And let me share my screen. Sorry about that.
Oh, you're good.
I'm handing things over to Shane now.
Awesome. Thanks, Bill. And yeah, thanks for this good conversation. Having lots of good questions already. So again, I'm Shane Valley. I am the co-project manager on the transportation side of the Lower Southeast Rising Plan. And so just to rehash sort of we kind of categorized all of the things that we heard from community members and that our own analysis told us about issues that our recommendations are seeking to address. The first sort of bucket of things was concerns about traffic safety, traffic calming, and the quality of the local street infrastructure, whether it's unpaved streets or lack of sidewalks. That was something that loomed large in all of the conversations that we had. Another bucket of things that we heard about was just the limited access to businesses, services, and community destinations by foot, by mobility device, by bike. And this is where sort of the land use and transportation combined look really pays off, because that particular set of issues rests 50-50 on both shoulders of land use and transportation, especially within the core area of the plan, the Brentwood-Darlington neighborhood. There's a real lack of places that are even close enough to walk or ride your bike to. But on the other hand, the infrastructure, if there were those things, the infrastructure for doing so is somewhat lacking, to put it nicely. And then the last bucket of things that we heard about were about the transit network, both how often the buses are coming and how useful the existing network is. Next slide. And so we kind of have come up with three counter buckets of solutions, and they don't correspond to the three sort of problem areas exactly, but those three buckets are first a series of recommended transportation projects, which would be capital construction projects that are delivered by the city, things that would change the street and how it works to make it safer to walk, to bike, to use a mobility device, to access transit. The second bucket of things that we're recommending are a series of programs that would address those local street conditions, traffic calming, where the transportation projects don't address it, and pointing out opportunities for community placemaking. And then the third bucket of recommendations were looking at the bus network, working with community members, working with our consultant we contracted with, Jarrett Walker and Associates, and working with our partner at TriMet to come up with feasible recommendations to change the bus network to work better for folks in the neighborhoods. Next slide. So I'm going to dive into each of those three buckets of recommendations. The first bucket was those transportation projects, and those are kind of split into two categories. The first category are corridor improvements, and those address conditions on busy streets, which are also the streets where we've made proposals to change either corridor designations, center designations, and zoning, so that we can have basically, we're focusing a lot of the growth on these busy streets. And so if we're going to have more people accessing more things on these busy streets, we also need those streets to be easier to cross. We need those streets to be easier to bike along, to walk along, to use transit along. And so our corridor improvement projects really focus on those streets. On the other side of the ledger are the neighborhood greenways, and those focus on conditions on local streets, and not all local streets, just a few key local streets. But our neighborhood greenways are it's a facility type that's common both in this project area, but around the city of Portland. And it's a facility that looks pretty much like any old major street, or not major street, but local street. But we employ a series of tools to make that street calmer, to bring car traffic to a more similar speed as the people who are walking and biking on the street, and just trying to make a low stress neighborhood street that feels safe and comfortable for people to ride, to walk, to use mobility devices on, and even to play on. Next slide. And these two project types really work together. And this is kind of a conceptual diagram that illustrates our general approach to these transportation projects in Lower Southeast and in this part of town. So much like the rest of Portland, this neighborhood consists of neighborhood cells where you have kind of an area with a somewhat fine street grid of mostly residential uses, bounded by busy streets on the outside. And so we took a look at each one of these neighborhood cells, and we looked at the busy streets, and we said, well, what does each one of these busy streets really need to be and do, and what improvements do we need to make such that the street feels safe because this is where the major destinations are, but it can be a barrier to moving between neighborhood cells. And so what do we need to do to these neighborhood streets to make them, busy streets, to make them feel safe and comfortable to cross, to walk along, to access transit, to bike along, to reach destinations there. And then we looked also at the neighborhood streets and said, well, we need to improve the circulation within the neighborhood. And we have to do this somewhat selectively, because in this part of town, there are so many streets that need love, that have need for sidewalks and for paving, and resources are limited. And so we have to be really smart about which streets we do improve. And the neighborhood greenways kind of take folks from these neighborhood cells to the centers and the corridors with these concentrations of destinations. Next slide. And this map basically shows that conceptual approach as applied to the project area. And so this is a map of the recommended corridor improvements and neighborhood greenways in the lower southeast rising area. You can see how basically all of the busy streets in the neighborhood, 52nd Avenue, 72nd Avenue, 92nd, Flaubel, Duke, Woodstock, Herald, Steele, they all have a corridor improvement project on them. And then you can see how the neighborhood greenways sort of bridge the gaps and help cross from neighborhood cell to neighborhood cell. Yeah, next slide. And so that all is a little bit inside baseball. That's all like, okay, here's the projects, and there's a project here and a project here, and this is what the project, this is where a crossing is going to be. But at the end of the day, this is kind of what you're buying. And so this is the scenario in which we find a way to build all of those projects. This is the future network of safe walking and biking streets. And the map does say future bike network, but one thing to note about all of these improvements, and when we make a bike improvement, in many ways, we're also making it safer for folks to walk. And so all of these blue lines that you see on the map on the major streets are also streets that have more frequent crossings. They have additional separation between auto traffic and people walking and walking. They also have improvements at intersections. Yeah, next slide. And so this is just a little bit more information. You can find more information about the corridor improvements on page 76 of the plan. And each one of the busy streets basically has its own page detailing the types of improvements that we see coming to it, where there might be crossings, where there are sidewalk gaps, and where we're going to fill them. And then other things for us to keep in mind as we're implementing these projects. Next slide. And this slide is just kind of like a flag for us and for community members, just noting that many of these corridor improvement projects propose improving the often existing bike lanes on these streets. And one thing to note about streets in this part of town is even the busy streets are quite narrow, 40 feet between the curbs, 44 feet between the curbs. That's the average. And there's a little table on the right-hand side that shows sort of which major streets in the plan area are which widths. And so basically, this is just noting that in a situation where we are looking to improve biking facilities, often there has to be a discussion about, well, there's not that much space. And so something sort of has to give a little bit so that we can get a little bit of a better situation for bikes. And so this is just noting that though we're recommending improved bike lanes on many streets, that there's another conversation that has to happen for each individual street and involve community members who are along that street to talk about these types of decisions and what does and doesn't work for community members. Next slide. And we have a similar section for our neighborhood greenway starting on page 92 of the plan. We also have for each neighborhood greenway a page that's dedicated to explaining more in detail what each one of these projects is going to do, some of the challenges is faced when we're implementing the project. Next slide. And that wraps up sort of the overview of the recommended transportation projects. There's a lot more sort of meat and potatoes in the actual plan. And so I encourage you to take a glance at that. The next bucket of recommendations were the bus network recommendations. So community members were really seeking transit service that better provides those connections within the plan area, not just connecting outside the plan area. And so we heard a few things consistently from community members. We heard that there's a desire for continuous east-west service on Woodstock Boulevard between the Woodstock Main Street around 52nd and Woodstock and the Lentz Town Center. Having that continuous east-west connection was something we heard time and again. A continuous north-south connection between the Brentwood-Darlington neighborhood and the Mount Scott Community Center and the businesses and services on Foster Road. And then an east-west continuous line on Flaubel Street between 52nd and Flaubel and 92nd and Flaubel, and where that connection to the MAX station is. There was also just a general desire for more transit service in the area. If you look at the map, there are these thick blue lines that represent TriMet's frequent transit service in the network that currently exists. And one thing you might notice is they're all kind of on the fringe of the plan area. There's no really higher intensity bus service in the area. And that's something that folks really notice and that they're really looking to improve. Next slide. So luckily for us and for you all, TriMet, at the same time as we were doing this exercise of trying to understand what could be better, was also doing its own exercise in short-term service planning. They were looking at how travel patterns have changed over the pandemic, and they were starting to see something stabilizing, and they were starting to see that their existing network was mismatched with how people were using it. And so they were really open to new ideas about how the bus network could be restructured to be more useful to more people. And so working with the community, working with our consultant, Jarrett Walker and Associates, and working with TriMet, we were able to craft a set of recommendations that TriMet was able to adopt several of. So one they were able to adopt was the continuous east-west line on Woodstock Boulevard and bumping that line up to frequent service. Another they were able to adopt was frequent service on line 71, that north-south bus line that's on 52nd Avenue. There were a couple of recommendations they weren't able to implement this time around, that continuous bus service on Full Bell and continuous bus service on Southeast 72nd. And so one of our main questions to the community is, hey, are these recommendations still worth pursuing, still worth pushing for? Next slide. And then the last bucket I'll talk about, I'll probably just breeze through this because we're running a little bit short on time, are basically to help fill the gaps that the recommended projects and the transit projects or the transit recommendations don't fill. And so those are things like local street improvements. We spend a lot of time talking to folks about local streets and which ones are most sort of challenging, and they're challenging everywhere. And so we had to kind of do a prioritization process where we said, okay, they're challenging everywhere. Which are challenging, but also have some kind of broader transportation system benefit so that the very few resources we have can be channeled in particular places. Portland in the Streets is just a toolkit that the city has to really support community ownership and transformation of the public space. And there's no shortage of sort of desire to sort of transform street space in this part of town. I mean, you go to unpaved streets throughout the area, and I mean, I've seen bike pump tracks, I've seen gardens that beautifully spill out into the street. I've seen beautiful pathways. And so this is just a toolkit to sort of help along with that. And then another programmatic approach is daylighting intersections, mostly on busy streets and at crossings of greenways and busy streets, just to improve safety and visibility. And I think I will skip the next slide just for time's sake. And so these are some of our kind of key questions. Everything that you've seen has gone through a good amount of vetting and validation with community members. And so we're hoping to also just showcase that a little bit more broadly, and then ask a few key questions in areas where we can make changes. And so we have some broad level questions like, hey, is this the right network of streets for us to improve? Does this completed network of streets take you where you want to go? Does it connect to most important places? It brings pretty much all parts of the plan area within 2 to 3 blocks of one of these safe, low stress streets to walk or bike along. And then we have other questions about our implementation approach. What things should we do first? We can't do this all at once. We probably can't do it all. We probably can't do any of it really fast. And so what is it most important to do now? What's most important to do next? What's most important to do later? And I think I will stop there and open it up for Q&A.
Great, thanks, Shane. Appreciate that. If anyone has questions on the transportation elements, Maria, I see your hand raised.
Yes, Maria is right. Actually, Shane, I have a couple of questions, I guess. And the first one would be, are you planning on any kind of bike parking, especially on those corridors? So once you bring people on the greenways and neighborhood streets and improve bike lanes and all that to those corridors, are you planning on any bike parking? Because right now that's a problem on Woodstock already. and I was actually hoping I could plant that idea of could we have some bike parking? There are 6 bike parking spots at the library right now. And I understand that Woodstock is only a certain amount of width and there's just no room to go there on bike. So what I do right now with my kids is I try to find a parking spot with the bikes and then we just convert into pedestrians. And that's totally fine. It would just be amazing to have more bike parking available.
No, that's
So-
a great question. And sorry, I'll let you ask your other, I can answer this really quickly.
Yeah,
I
go
can
ahead.
probably, we do have a kind of a guerrilla team of folks that does try to find opportunistic places to put those staples or work with businesses to say, hey, like there's a lot of demand for biking. Can you chip in some money and we can install this and we'll get out of your hair really fast. And so I'll ask about that. You're thinking specifically, I guess in the short term, you're thinking specifically Woodstock, but generally,
Right.
you're
Hopefully,
thinking
eventually I
that-
can go to different corridors. Yeah.
Yeah,
But right
you're
now it would
thinking
be
on all these
Woodstock.
streets.
That's the only
Okay.
one I have. Yeah.
Cool. Other question you had? Or was
Yeah.
that
My
it?
second question is about Bike Town. Is there any thoughts or plans to extend the service area? Right now, they are stopping at, I think it is Holgate and Foster. So right where the project service
Yeah.
area begins is where the Bike Town service area stops. So I was wondering if that's maybe an opportunity to bring another layer of infrastructure to the neighborhood.
I don't know where their expansion plans sit. I know that in the recent past, they did quite a large expansion. And so I'll have to ask. They've also expanded the number of bikes and they're all e-bikes. And so that's something that I'll ask about and I can either try to update you or put some information about the plan in the plan, just about what that timeline can look like. It's a good question.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to read a question from the chat and then I'll call on Katie. Peter says, if the plan's adopted, can you speak to the prioritization and or relative timing to implement the proposed corridor neighborhood greenway capital improvements?
Yeah, so that is actually one of the questions we have for community members in our open houses. So within each category, you might have noticed, and I didn't talk about it and probably should have just kind of ran out of time. There's a tiering to or there's a prioritization. There's a tier 1 and a tier 2 within each of those project types. The tier 1 projects generally we're going to focus on doing in the next 5 years. We're going to focus on developing them, design, going out in the community saying, hey, this is what we're thinking. What do you think? Does this work for you? Does this not? Okay, how do we find and design, getting these projects shovel ready? That'll be our focus for the next few years. And so that is our priority in terms of within those buckets. But between those buckets, do we focus more on the corridor improvements? Do we focus more on the neighborhood greenways? That is a question that we actually have for the community right now. So it's a bit of an open question.
Thank you. Katie?
Hey, my question is kind of also near the Woodstock Library. There's a 5-story building being built right across the street. From what I understand, they will only be paving the street directly behind it, adding one sidewalk on the building side, and no other streets are being paved with this new building. My question is, what is the city kind of planning to do to help support kind of these new developments and kind of the infrastructure around them? Because it seems like if a 5-story building on Woodstock is not going to be, if the streets behind it aren't going to be paved, then it's not really, 200 new units. It just seems like a lot of people kind of adding into an area that already has like nowhere to go, no sidewalks. So in these other areas, like is that going to be a problem as well when those buildings are built?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that Woodstock area is a little bit unique just because all of those, just the way the development pattern happened, a lot of those east-west streets that run parallel to the Woodstock Main Street they're not paved, or the pavement quality is really poor. They're not continuously paved. So it is a little bit of a unique situation, but it does bear thinking about for some of these other areas where we're looking at changing the zoning to have more sort of intense type growth. in terms of what the city is doing to help situations like that, there's one tool that we've had a lot of success with recently, and even in the plan area, local improvement district. We have a local improvement district right now in the Arrow Heights neighborhood to help them sort of pave and add stormwater management to a lot of their streets. And that's a tool that can really apply for something like a main street or the area around the main street, where basically the city kicks in funding, some of the neighbors kick in funding, some of the we are able to bring transportation system development charges, which developers or development pays into, and make targeted improvements to streets like that support more growth, but support it in the right places and make sure that the right infrastructure is in place, so that we're not just dumping 200 people into a muddy, gravelly, potholed street. So it's something that we're thinking about, but I think we don't have a really coordinated approach right now.
Great, thank you. And I do want to keep us on time, so there are more comments in the chat. We will also have a way for you to reach out to project staff with your questions that we will provide to you at the end of this presentation. But if Bill and Shane, if you want to proceed, but also maybe read through the chat and see if there's anything you want to highlight or pull out as well.
I think I answered one question or provided some information related to plexes at 52nd by Ogden and Rule. And I think I'll let Shane respond maybe via text about questions, but I wanted to be sure to share just ways of learning more about the plan and how to provide input, because that's a pretty critical piece. So just one moment. Let's see. Sorry about that. Wayne will be putting this to the chat, but I want to make sure you're aware of some of the major ways of providing input. We have actually an online open house where at your convenience, you could read about the major proposals from the plan. And there are also some questions that provide opportunities for you to provide your feedback. We also have a map app. You know, what I was sharing you in terms of the land use changes are fairly bubbly, but we have a map app where you could enter an address and see if something's proposed for it and see what specific zone is proposed for a specific property. And I'm going to I'll highlight how you can use those resources, but we also have the discussion draft document itself, which I believe Wing has already put into the chat. And then you can submit any questions or input to the project email, which we'll also put into the chat. And right now we're aiming to have our comments through June 23rd. So if you could provide your comments by June 23rd, yeah, that'll be great. And I'm going to stop sharing, but I'm going to try going into our online open house just to highlight what's there. Just a moment. Let's see. Going to the map app first. So the map app is our tool which shows where all the zone changes are proposed. And just you could enter an address and it'll bring you the information. I'll just click a property here. And here it's showing a property on 72nd, which if you look at the right bar, it shows what the existing zoning is. And here it's a single dwelling R2.5, that's a townhouse type zone. And it's proposed for the small scale multi-dwelling RM1, and just provide some information on those space zones. And a key thing is you can provide comments. You can provide comments on this specific property, or your comments could be about the project in general. And I'm going to shift over to another component. Now, let's see, can people see our lower southeast rising area plan discussion draft? Or is it still showing the map up? Yep. Okay. Wing will provide a link to our online open house. This is really a useful tool. If you're not up to reading 150 pages of the plan, we really do encourage it. But if you want to have basically that summary, the snapshot of the major proposals, this will walk you through the proposals, provide some background information. In fact, a lot of what we presented today is here. So you have another chance to take a closer look at what is in or what we shared and presented. But I wanted to highlight one thing that's part of this is we have a series of questions like we did tonight, one set of questions after the land use proposals. It presents some options you could choose from, or you could have more of an open-ended response to what's in the proposals. And one thing to make sure you're aware of is when you get through those questions, be sure to hit the submit button. That's pretty critical to make sure your input is recorded. So I'm going to stop sharing. But I think if there's one place I'd encourage you to go to, it'd be to that online open house, because that has links to the project document and has links to the map app. So I'm going to stop sharing. And we're pretty close to wrapping up. But yeah. Notice, Tim, you have your hand up.
Hi, Bill. I didn't want to speak out of turn just because I sat on a project advisory committee, but I just want to remind people that not only is this draft, but nothing has a budget attached to it or anything like that. Like, this is all just planning going forward. So when that day comes, there's an idea of what could go forward with a budget later. So I know Shane mentioned like 5 years down the line, like just rezoning doesn't mean these things are going to be developed and these buildings are going to get thrown up. This is, I think in the project, we talked like 10, 20-year timeline of how to build up the neighborhood a little bit. So lots of time to add in your feedback. And I highly encourage people to go do that through the links they provided.
Thanks, Tim. And Tim's been a participant in our advisory committee discussions. It's a very, very insightful group of people. And yeah, that's very much the case with zoning. Zoning is typically a long-term proposition. So we have zoning proposed for 72nd that would allow over time a commercial main street to develop, but it's not going to happen overnight. Typically, people might start out doing things like maybe converting their house or residence to a commercial use. It's typically not the case that you see a whole lot of change right away. And the zoning, it's more something that provides an opportunity versus ensures that's going to happen, especially in the near term. It's going to be really dependent on market conditions. Is the property owner interested in actually doing these things? Zoning never forces a change. It just, if you have a property owner who wants to do something allowed by zoning, it's allowed. But it is a first step. If our zoning does not allow businesses, which is the case for most of the area, there's no hope to even really start a neighborhood business district from starting. But the zone changes proposed would really open up that possibility. If we're zoning to allow for a commercial main street, it can start happening. If we don't change zoning, it's simply not going to happen. And we don't have many opportunities to have a new look at an area. I think the last time we did a plan for this area was back in the mid-90s. So 30 years ago. And so we're not sure when we're going to come back. So we definitely value people's close attention to what's being proposed. And just bear in mind, especially for the land use components, it's a long-term prospect, something that is about allowing things to happen over the next several decades.
I just want to quickly follow up on something Tim said. Thank you for saying that. I don't think that we at the city do a good enough job of explaining what a plan is. And Tim is right in that there's not money for implementation, for building these things attached to this plan. But what a plan is and what it does, plans often, if they're good, and if we share them with the right people in the right places in the right time, they often acquire momentum. it is a tool that we use internally to advocate for this neighborhood. We use it to advocate at city council. We use it to advocate with our regional and federal partners for grant money. And it's also going to be a tool that you all can use with us or against us to say, hey, you said you guys were going to do this. Don't come back to us asking what we need until you guys have this done. This is our wish list. And so this is your chance to sort of shape what that wish list is. What is our homework for the next 5-10 years? What should we really be focusing on when we have money to spend in this area? What should we do? So yeah, please help us make sure that we have the right wish list.
And I want to make sure, let's see, Wing, did you paste in the links to those resources? And probably the most important one being the online open house, because that's basically your entrance to all the other different resources. They're links from the online open house to the various resources. Great, that's it. That's the one. That's the most important link that will get you to the various resources.
Great. Well, I think that wraps us up. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And thank you, Bill and Shane, for providing the insightful information as well. Just a reminder that input is welcome and encouraged until June 23rd. So please visit the online open house and give your input. All right. Well, thank you all. This brings us to a close. Really appreciate you being here. Thanks.
Thanks, especially for sacrificing your dinner times for joining us and talking about some things that for many people are not your daily dinner time conversation.
Thank you all so much.